Hi, welcome to another episode of the Thoughts with Lakshman podcast. Um, in my podcast, I discuss a range of topics. Mainly, I focus on German culture, Ger- German society, German as a language, philosophy philosophy a bit too. I spoke about Immanuel Kant and Karl Marx. And I started off learning German as a language in my sophomore year. In part of my language learning course, I did activities where I started to learn more about the culture. And as I started to learn more about the culture, I became more interested in the culture. And I really, so then from there, from the culture, so then I started doing more research and reading and stuff like that. And that's what really got me to start the podcast because I was doing so much research and reading. I was gaining this information, so I wanted to be able to share it. And so in today's episode of the podcast, we're going to be focusing on the political process in Germany. And just so you know, my podcast is available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, all the podcast platforms. It's also on YouTube. And yeah, I use Anchor to record my podcast. But yeah, let's get straight to it. So we're going to be focusing on the political process in Germany, um, how elections work, um, just to understand it, because I think it's really interesting to compare. And so we're going to focus and understand and discuss how it works in Germany, and then we're going to compare some major differences at the very end. But we're going to mainly spend majority of the time learning about Germany, how it works in Germany. So, national elections to the Bundestag, they're held every 4 years. All German citizens, at least age 18, are eligible to vote, and this was actually reduced from age 21 in 1970, so they got the same age as us. However, um, 16-year-olds are eligible to vote in municipal elections in some states or regions, or Landes in German. In 2011, Bremen became the first Land, which is a German word, it's a region, to extend suffrage to 16-year-olds for state elections. Um, the basic law established a mixed electoral system consisting of elements of both plurality and proportionality. So half of the Bundestag's members are elected to represent single seat constituencies, and another half are elected through proportional representation. So voters cast two ballots. Constituency representatives are elected by the distribution of votes on the first ballot, and the candidate winning the most votes secures election to the Bundestag. Voters cast ballots for political parties at the regional level, and with their second vote, or Zweitstimme, which is called what's known as in German, and their second vote determines overall party representation. So a party must win at least 5% of the national vote or win at least three constituencies to secure representation. And the number of seats it's allocated, the party, is based on its proportion of second votes. So basically, the system is designed to simultaneously provide a link between citizens and elected representatives and a legislator that reflects almost a consensus of opinions in the country. So it's a democratic government. Um, Bundesrat members are appointed by the state governments, and the body, or the Bundesrat, exercises its authority to protect the rights and prerogatives of state governments. Um, each state is allocated between 3 and 6 members of the Bundesrat, depending on population. That's a major difference, by the way. when I was reading through, doing research, and I was making my notes for the podcast, this between the 3 and 6 members for the Bundesrat, depending on population, that struck me as the one of the biggest differences between the United States government and German government. Imagine if California had 6 representatives and South Dakota had 3, because that's effectively how it is in Germany. So that's interesting. It's very interesting. Um, but yeah, the quadrennial, general, and provincial elections, as well as local elections, they're really attended with the greatest interest and involvement by the electorate, and the public is kept informed on political issues through intense media coverage. And we're going to focus another podcast on the German media. Um, but they have Germany's a first world country. They have many different strong media platforms, and yeah, and political affairs, they're frequently debated among German citizens, just as they are in the United States. So that's similar. Um, I don't. I'm gonna focus on the. I haven't researched the media that much yet. I'm going to do it more because I wrote it down as a great idea for a podcast. But I wouldn't imagine that there is such a sharp division between different media networks, as there is today in the U.S. Um, and also, like, not just a division of opinion, but also like a dislike for other obviously media networks are not going to like each other because they're competing with each other, but there's a real hatred for other media networks in the United States. um, Although voting is not compulsory in Germany, the participation rate is high, with about three-fourths of eligible voters casting ballots. Now that's interesting too, because in the United States, it's not like that. In the United States, I believe 55% of all people in the United States voted in the last election, which is nowhere close to three-fourths. Now, remember that Germany has, far fewer people in their country. I believe the German population is around 70, 80 million. The United States population is around 330 million. Um, However, three-fourths is really good. It's a really good rate. Since elections in the states are staggered throughout the life of each Bundestag, they act as a bellwether almost of public opinion for the incumbent federal government. Um, and you could say um, a similar concept exists in the United States. The midterm elections do often predict on a way, almost. They can give away what's going to happen in the presidential elections. And yeah, so that's another similarity. Um, German citizens, along with German residents who are citizens of other EU countries, also elect representatives to the European Parliament. Um, Although voter participation in these contests tends to be much lower than in general or state elections. But yeah, let's now focus from a more general, bird's eye view of everything to a more detailed, and let's talk about different political parties in Germany. So the sheer proliferation of Germany's political parties contributed to the downfall of the Weimar Republic in 1933, have shown an increasing tendency, towards consolidation since the early days of the Federal Republic. Um, Smaller parties generally have either allied themselves with larger ones or have shrunk into insignificance, or also some have vanished. Reunified Germany has in effect only two numerically major parties: the Christian Democratic Union, or the CDU, and the Social Democratic Party of Germany, which is the SPD, and neither of which, can easily attain a parliamentary majority. So that's similar to the United States, right? We have two major parties, Democrats and Republicans, and there's a good contest between them. They're pretty split, just as it seems like they are in Germany. Um, However, here's where they differ. Actually, not really differ, but in addition, there are four, smaller but still important parties. You have the Christian Social Union, um, the Free Democratic Party. Um, you also have, the Green Party, the Left Party, and yeah, yeah. So those are your four other parties: the Green Party, the Left Party, the Christian Social Union, and the Free Democratic Party. Now, the difference between Germany and the United States is that these other parties, these four other smaller parties, are still significant, and that they'll have seats in government. They may not win elections, um, but uh, they have power. In the United States, you only have two parties who have representatives in government. And then you have third party candidates who run for president. And sometimes, for example, in Florida in 2000, um, you can argue that the third party candidate influenced the election because it was so close and he took away votes from Al Gore. But generally speaking, third parties in the United States are really, really insignificant and don't play a major role at all. In Germany, however, they are important. Even though they're smaller and you have two major parties, they're important. Fringe political parties, such as the Republicans, Die Republikaner in German, or the German's People's Union, and the Pirate Party of German, have scored some success at the local and state levels, but they haven't won representation at the national level. And the 5% threshold, for elections for the second ballot, as we spoke about earlier, it's actually yeah, it's been very effective at excluding radical parties of whatever stripe and in preventing the formation of splinter parties. Because, it's not crazy to think that a small radical party could do well in some region of Germany, some part of Germany could do well, and you could see that. So the 5% threshold makes it almost impossible. Even though 5% isn't that high, that's why you have more than two parties, two important parties. But it still serves in preventing um, radical parties from forming. Additionally, you also have, I guess you could say, um, I don't know the best way to describe it, but there are more. The thing is, with Germany, the political landscape is more complicated because sometimes two parties that are similar in many ways but differ, so that they're different parties that exist, they take away votes from each other. So there's another complex layer that exists in German politics. However, the proportional element of the German electoral system has necessitated the formation of coalition governments. And since 1966, all federal governments have been composed of at least two parties. And dissent within the major parties is contained in the wings and factions of each represented respective party. So yeah, let's go even more specific, right? So we started off big general by talking about general politics in Germany. Now then we focused on political parties. Well, we start off with talking about government in Germany, then we spoke about political parties, and now we're going to talk about individual parties. So, the Christian Democratic Party. So, the CDU, the Christian Democratic Party, it's a center right party that endorses conservative social values and the social market economy. In government for much of Germany's post-war World War II history, it headed, governments from 1949 to 1966 and 1982 to 1998. It returned to power in 2005, and yeah, the CDU is really a successor of the old Catholic Center Party and kindred bourgeois parties, either Protestant or non-sectarian. In a country in which one's religion often determine one's politics, the party's strongest constituents are still in the Roman Catholic districts, although the sectarian Christian aspect is of only incidental emphasis, chiefly among older voters. The party, strongly endorses Germany's leading role in the EU, its membership in NATO, a free market economy, and vigorous material assistance to the countries of the former communist bloc, especially, the one-time Soviet republics. It is established in all states except for Bavaria, where the more conservative CCU functions as its counterpart and effectively, a permanent coalition. A branch of the CDU, existed in Germany throughout that country's history. However, it was only tolerated to preserve of the facade of a multi-party system. Um, with the overthrow, of the ruling communist regime in East Germany's first three free elections on March 18, 1990, it was this Rum party that took power by a large mandate with, Lothar de Maizière as a minister president presiding over the 6-month transitional period. Social Democrats have been in government for many, many years, from 1966 to 1982, 98 to 2009, and it's the heir to the Marxist parties of the 19th century. In East Germany, which historically was really the stronghold of the socialist movement in Germany, this, the SPD, or Socialist Democrats, was subsumed by the formation of the SED in 1946. In West Germany, the SPD's early post-war leadership, which drew strength from its record of opposition to Nazis, adhered rigorously to orthodox Marxism and opposed vehemently the communist movement from which it split in the early 20th century and rejected West Germany's rearmament and the country's integration into the Western military defense system. In 1959, however, the SPD and the so-called Bad Godesberg resolution discarded its doctrinaire approach. Nationalization of industry was dropped in favor of gradualist reform, and appeals to class warfare were abandoned. The party broadened its base to attract, increasingly greater segments of the middle class, and the SPD was cautious about unification, fearing that it would unleash, enormous financial and emotional costs. Unlike the CDU, the SPD did not initially gain a windfall of votes in Eastern Germany. The Free Democrats. So, because neither the CDU or the CSU nor the SPD have generally been able to win enough votes to capture a majority of the seats in the Bundestag, the balance of power has often rested with the FDP or the Free Democrats. The successor of the older German liberal parties, the FDP has generally adopted free trade, pro business, and anti clerical positions. The party now serves as a liberal alternative to the CDU and SPD and often exercises a power far beyond the 6 to 10% support it regularly receives in national elections. Now, for example, FDP leader Hans Dietrich Genscher, Germany's foreign minister from 1974 to 1992, was often viewed as the architect of German unification. In 2009, it won its best ever electoral results, 14.6% of the national vote, and formed a governing coalition with the ruling CDU and CSU. The Greens, so this is an ecologist party, was formed in West Germany in 1980 and merged with the Eastern German Alliance in 1993. It has been the only completely new party to win national representation in the post World War II era, formed mainly by a younger group of environmentalists, opponents of nuclear power, and pacifists. The Greens Party successfully broke the 5% barrier for the first time in the 1983 election. And on the heels of the nuclear power plant accident in Ukraine in 1986, the Greens captured in excess of 8% of the vote and sent 22 delegates to the Bundestag. However, disputes between the realists who took a pragmatic approach to environmental policies and fundamentalists who, you know, don't favor compromise and instead want ideological purity have weakened, the party's constituent factions. And in 1990, the Green Party failed to surpass the 5% threshold. However, its union with the Lines 90 enabled it to re-enter the Bundestag beginning in 1994, and from 1998 to 2005, it served as a junior partner in an SPD-led coalition. The party increased its representation in the Bundestag to 68 seats in the 2009 election, and a catastrophic accident at Japan's Fukushima nuclear plant in 2011 sparked a massive surge in support for Greens at the state level. In March 2011, an impressive showing in Baden-Württemberg, traditionally a CDU stronghold, won the Greens their first state government at the head of the coalition with the SPD. The Left Party, and it was really formed as an alliance between the PDS and the disillusioned members of the SPD and of the Green Party, who had established the electoral alternative for labor and social justice in Western Germany. The PDS was the successor party to East Germany's former ruling party, the SED, which controlled the entire government apparatus until the system's demise in 1989 to 1990. After unification, the SED lost most of its supporters and members. And the PDS won 11% of the vote in Eastern Germany in the first all-German election in 1990, giving it 17 seats in the Bundestag. Um, Additionally, you know, during the 1990s, the party gained strength in Eastern Germany, and in Eastern Germany, unemployment remained really high, and economic conditions weren't really improving that much. Although it did not surpass the 5% threshold in 1994, the PDS won enough constituency seats to gain Bundestag representation, and in 1998 it captured 5.1% of the vote, including some 20% in the former East German territories. The PDS largely remained a regional party, but it scored successes in Eastern German states and even formed a coalition government, with the SPD in Berlin in 2002. In 2002, it again failed to cross the 5% threshold, but in 2005, the PDS and its left allies in Western Germany, together known as the Left Party, captured nearly 9% of the national vote and won more than 50 seats in the Bundestag. Support for the Left Party continued to grow, and in 2009 it won nearly 12% of the national vote and increased its number of seats in the Bundestag to 76. So, fringe parties. So, in the late 20th century, the rightist Republican Party, the DVU, were the most visible of Germany's fringe parties. With their tiny memberships, neither of these parties has been able to really surmount, the 5% barrier in national elections. The National Democratic Party of Germany, Nationaldemokratische Partei Deutschlands, or the NPD, is the oldest of the country's right-wing parties and was formed in 1964. It gained little support in national elections, though it was able to enter several state parliaments in the late 1960s. In the 1980s and 90s, the Republicans in the DVU won seats in several state legislatures, with the Republican support mainly concentrated in Bavaria, Baden-Württemberg, and Berlin. The DVU, which is originally formed in 1971, achieved its electoral breakthrough in the 1990s when it won representation in Schleswig-Holstein and fared particularly well in eastern Germany, where it won 13% in Saxony-Anhalt's state election in 1998. Although the rightist parties have distinct policies and have been unable to coalesce around a united platform, they share an they really dislike the Germany's liberal immigration policies and have generally been regarded as neo-fascist in orientation. The NPD and DVU attempted to merge in 2010, but a legal challenge by a group of state DVU organizations successfully blocked the move. The Pirate Party of Germany, an outgrowth of the larger Pirate Party movement that began in Sweden in 2006, promoted a broadly populist platform that focused on copyright reform and internet freedom. The Pirate Party used open source software to facilitate group decision making, a process the party called liquid democracy. In essence, really, the party's platform was subject to electronic referendum by its members, and riding a wave of anti-establishment sentiment, the Pirates scored a string of electoral success at the state level in 2011, 2012, where they won representation in regional legislatures in Berlin, Saarland, Schleswig-Holstein, and North Rhine-Westphalia. The far-right Alternative for Germany, or Alternative für Deutschland, AfD, was founded in 2013 primarily as a vehicle for Eurosceptic sentiment in the wake of the Eurozone debt crisis. It quickly won a modest measure of success in regional elections, but the party's popularity exploded when it changed its focus to opposing immigration. As the European migrant crisis intensified, and Chancellor Angela Merkel remained committed to an open door policy toward refugees, the AfD embraced an openly populist Islamophobic platform. It built a sizable base in Germany's formerly communist East, and in 2017 it entered the Bundestag for the first time. Although the AfD represented the third largest parliamentary group, behind the CDU, CSU, and SPD, the mainstream parties ruled out the possibility of including the AfD in any coalition talks. And the AfD is what I spoke about in the last podcast episode, because this party really gained popularity after opposing immigration. In the last podcast, we focused on the settlement and immigration patterns in Germany um, for the last for the last maybe 100, 200 years, and why the natives are becoming increasingly angry um, with immigrants, and that's part of the reason that the AfD party has become much more popular in recent times, because it was only founded in 2013 and now it has seats in the Bundestag. So it's concerning for for Angela Merkel and many people in Germany. But yeah, that brings us to the end of the podcast. Thank you for listening to the podcast. Just to recap, we discussed generally the German political system, the German government, actually, the general German government, how elections work, how many seats you have, each party has. Then we discussed political parties. There are really two major parties in Germany, four smaller parties that are still important, and then you have some fringe parties that struggle to get the 5% threshold. When people vote, they vote on two things: candidates, and then they also for the parties. And then additionally, um, we spoke at the end about the individual parties, what they support. There are a lot of party partnerships in Germany because you have many more parties than the United States. You really have two. Um, but yeah, it's interesting. It's very interesting. But yeah, thank you for listening to the podcast. And yeah, I hope you listen to many more in the future. Goodbye.